Welcome to The Signal, the podcast companion to the only intelligence report in men's health and fitness that tells you what to watch, what to ignore, and why. I'm Andy Feltovich, founder and CEO. Every episode, we go deeper than the newsletter. Longer conversations, harder questions, and the stories behind the data. We don't do bro science, we don't do wellness theater, and we question everything except questioning. Every dogma on trial, guilty until proven innocent. If you're new here, The Signal is produced by Andy Feltovich, the flagship company of the Collegium of Order and Flow. Subscribe to the newsletter at the-signal.us. Don't forget the hyphen. And if this episode is worth 5 stars to you, leave a review. It's the single best thing that you can do to help us cut through the noise. Now let's get into it. Today we have Andrew Nevin, research professor and inaugural director of the Brainomics Venture at the Center for BrainHealth at the University of Last time, best time. You got this, bro. Today we have Andrew Nevin, research professor and inaugural director of the Brainomics Venture at the Center for BrainHealth at the University of Texas at Dallas. Andrew holds a PhD in economics from Harvard, an MA in philosophy and politics from Oxford, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar, and a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and Mathematics from Western University. Before joining the Center for Brain Health, Andrew spent 36 years as an entrepreneur, private equity investor, economist, and strategy consultant. He started at McKinsey, served as president of United Family Hospitals in Beijing, including leading the hospital through the SARS crisis, and spent 11 years as advisory partner and chief economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Nigeria. He co-authored the OECD Brain Capital Index Committee and co-authored Flourishing in Canada, How to Get the Good Life. Disclaimer, this is for informational purposes only and should not be interpreted as medical advice. Welcome, Andrew. It's a great honor to have you today.
It's my honor to be with you.
All right. Well, as you know, on this podcast, nothing is sacred, so we're going to start off with something that's near and dear to both of us, economics. You're an economist by training, Harvard PhD. I'm an economist too by training. And economists like to look at utility and preferences in a certain way, which you've analyzed extensively, going back to the progenitor of the term, Jeremy Bentham. So tell us about how economists view utility and preferences and how that's changed with your training in neuroscience and the Center for Brain Health and what that means for cognitive health and performance.
All right. Very fantastic question. So let us start. I mean, of course, many people, listeners here will have taken their economics. They may not remember it. Back in microeconomics 101 at college, you had the idea of an individual maximizing their utility against a utility function. So they had a function for the utility. Well, what utility would they get for a beer, the second beer? What utility would they get from going to the theater? What utility would they get from going to the gym, etc.? And they made decisions around that utility function. But there's a few problems with that. I mean, the number one problem, which I started thinking about back in the 1980s when I was in graduate school, is where do these preferences actually come from? In the economics textbook, they kind of arrive fixed and just given to the individual or fixed with the individual. But of course, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, all the things that we kind of value in life really end up being a kind of product of our life and our experience over time. And of course, someone that comes from a certain environment is more likely to have preferences for some things rather than other things. Things like the food that they choose, even to the point of the religion on that. So it's really an incomplete theory. But what's happened in the last few decades, as you said, is neuroscience has come along and said, actually, we now know a lot more about how the brain works. And of course, the brain is what's underlying the decisions that people make. So I think that what's really important about this is that, and I think we're doing here at the Center for Brain Health, is how do we move beyond the economist kind of thinking about the way people work to actually the way people work based on the true science about the brain. So that's what we're all about at the Center for Brain Health.
Okay. So let's define some terms. You said we talked about something in the pre-interview, some misconceptions about cognitive health and cognitive performance. Most of those tests are framed in terms of cognitive decline, a topic in the news due to our current president, previous president. So they'll ask you to do things like, do you recognize these three animals? Do you recognize these three popular figures? But the Center for Health and Performance defines cognitive health differently, specifically accounting for upside performance. So please explain to us how you deal with cognitive performance.
So you're exactly right. So what you just referred to is called MOCA, or the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, and it's really a tool to identify early mild cognitive impairment, early Alzheimer's, early Parkinson's. And it's a very simple test out of 30. You identify some animals, you draw a clock face, you try to remember, I think, 5 numbers forward, 4 numbers backwards, a few words that they ask you at one point and then later. And any functioning adult, anyone over the age of about 13 or 14, is going to get close to the maximum, which is 30 for that test. But it doesn't really measure your cognitive ability. I mean, for us at the Center for Brain Health, cognition is really around your ability to do critical reasoning, analyze complex innovation, have innovative thinking, being able to hold multiple ideas in your mind at the same time, kind of oppositional thinking. And so one of the things that's very important to us is how do you design measurements of cognition that actually don't have that closed end? Like the top is 30, and as I said, most adults I think they define, these things are always defined, normal adult functioning is between 26 and 30. So, but there's nothing beyond 30. We have designed tests that say, actually, it's the upward potential that we're really interested in. And your objective, if you want your brain to function well in a cognitive sense, the objective is that your brain is continually getting better at these things. So you need a way of measuring that has that upward potential, and you can get better and better at it.
Okay. So let's talk about that upward potential a little bit. Common misconception that cognitive performance peaks 30 to 40 years old, and that it's kind of a fact of life to be passively dealt with rather than something to be actively managed. So please explain to us what actually changes with age. What levers can we pull to continue to optimize our brain health, and what are the inevitable consequences of aging?
Well, let me start out with the concept of neuroplasticity. So if we go back to when I was in college in the 70s, every time you had a beer with a group of people, you were told, oh, we're all losing 10,000 neurons, but we have enough excess neurons. It's okay. So there was this idea of the brain being a static, fixed object. And of course, there were things you could do to damage it that would make it worse, but there was really no change in the brain. And over time, as you said, the idea was the brain would kind of slowly decline. There wasn't much you could do about that. What the neuroscience has done over the last 40 years is, in fact, showed that the brain is the most modifiable part of the body. Excuse me. And we call that neuroplasticity. The brain is plastic, and it's changing all the time. It's changing all the time from things that you do internally, so how you think, what you think about, the kind of emotions you have. It's changing all the time from things that are happening externally. And we'll talk a little bit, for example, about nutrition and exercise. So now the brain is neuroplastic. So then the idea that it's in inevitable decline gets challenged. And what we're finding in our research at the Center for Brain Health is there are things that you can do to make your brain last at its peak performance better and better. And in fact, my boss, who founded the Center for Brain Health, the famous Dr. Sandy Chapman, would challenge you to say, you want your best brain, no matter what your age is, you want your best brain years to be ahead of you, your next brain year to be next year. Now, what are the types of things you can do about that? I mean, we'll talk, as I said, about nutrition and exercise and those related things. But the number one thing that you can do with your brain if you want it to function at peak cognitive capacity is practice the things that use cognition. So if you're going to be good at problem solving, if you're going to be good at integrated reasoning, being able to synthesize large amounts of information, if you're going to be good at innovative thinking and kind of thinking of creative solutions, you have to practice those things. It's the same way, if you want it to be good at tennis, you have to hit a tennis ball. If you want your brain to cognitively work well, you have to practice the things that make it cognitively work well, which is these complex reasoning, as I said. Now, but we don't advocate at the Center for Brain Health that you go out and you add exercises to your day. The reality is all of us have complex days. All of us have complex demands in our life. if you use the right cognitive strategies on those complex problems that you already have in your life, you're going to find your brain lasts better in a cognitively sense for as long as possible.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's so intuitive to me, but it's apparently so mysterious to others. The said principle, specific adaptations to imposed demand. So it's one of the three principles of training. So periodization, progressive
Right.
overload, and specificity. But instead of getting better at tennis by practicing hitting a tennis ball, people go off and they do all these goofy things with apps and brain games that have little or no transferability to what they actually want to get good at with their brain.
Right. So we would say, we often get asked, what about Sudoku? And I mean, our response, or the neuroscience response from us is pretty simple. It's if you like doing Sudoku, go do Sudoku. But if you want to have kind of a higher order cognition in terms of, as I said, kind of complex problem solving, synthesizing information, innovation, those are the things you actually need to do. And Sudoku is, as you said, kind of a specific skill that isn't going to get you to maintaining that kind of brain cognition peak level throughout your life for as long as possible.
So I want to dial it back a second, because you talked about neuroplasticity and the work you did in graduate school. So here I'm dusting off some brain cells and testing my neuroplasticity. I think it was Roger Sperry chemoaffinity hypothesis in 1963. I think that was the work he won the Nobel Prize for. He which brought that revolution that you're talking about in neuroplasticity, where we used to think that you were kind of whatever brain God dealt you, you're kind of stuck with it and fixed with that. So I want to spend a little time, and if you can walk us through that twin evolution. So you had your economics training, graduate school, where you studied utility, going back to Jeremy Bentham, and then parallel to that was the revolution, neuroplasticity, like I said, starting with Roger Sperry. And then parallel to that was the cognitive scientist, Herbert Simon, satisficing. So tell us how you mixed all those data points in a pot and came up with the current stew, the current brew that you know of his preferences and choices.
Well, so when I worked on my PhD thesis in the 80s around preferences and really kind of a philosophical critique of kind of this utility theory, no one else was really interested in it at the time. So in the 80s, I had really no collaborators, no one else interested in the same. So it was very lonely endeavor on that. And I got my PhD, and I actually said to myself at the time, a little bit of a segue, but I don't know very much about the world. So let me go out and work. So I thought I would work for a few years and come back to academics and continue it. It ended up being a 36-year journey outside of academics to learn about the world. I did learn about the world. I had the great privilege to kind of live my professional life, a quarter in Asia, a quarter in Africa, a quarter in Europe, a quarter in North America. And then I got the chance, because I started working on the concept of human flourishing, to be connected to the Center for Brain Health. And they were very interested in getting an economist. So what they were finding was they had all these ideas that they had worked out we have worked out better than anyone else. How do you really improve cognition practically for different populations? So we have programs for adolescents. We have programs for warriors, particularly special ops. We have programs for organizations. We have programs really for older adults. But then the question becomes, how do you get a larger uptake on that? And that's when you kind of get this marriage of economics and neuroscience. My boss, again, Sandy Chapman, who created the center and really created the concept of brain health, said, we really need, if we're going to get widespread people thinking about their brain, widespread the idea of thinking about your brain performance, it's a lot easier if there's also an economic argument, because people often listen to economics more than necessarily kind of neuroscience. Or at least if they both work together, then you're going in the same direction. So she coined the term Brainomics, which is really a different type of thinking about the brain and a different type of thinking about economics. It was really saying, if we can improve the brain performance, maximize the brain performance throughout the life cycle, what is the economic impact of that? And so then I came out of the private sector, finally got a chance to be an academic and think about those problems. So this is what brings it all together, the neuroplasticity and the economics and the kind of specific interventions we have. what is if we take, for example, we have a program for adolescents, so that the kids in middle school, so grade 6 to grade 9, focuses on critical reasoning skills, synthesis of information. What is the economic impact of improving those skills at that critical point in people's lifetime? Or more broadly, at an organization, we have programs with different companies where you go in and you try to teach these higher order cognitive skills and improve them. What's the impact on organizational performance, whether it's through productivity or reduced burnout or increased product attendance, like less absenteeism, et cetera. So that's how these ideas have kind of come together over the lifetime. So it's really exciting to me because these were ideas that I started thinking about from an economic and philosophical viewpoint in the 80s. But now we actually have some neuroscience. When I introduce myself, sometimes I say I studied philosophy in addition to economics. So really, philosophy is neuroscience without the science. But now we have the neuroscience.
Yeah, I'm glad you got that real world experience. There's a saying that theory without practice is foolish. Practice without theory is dangerous. So I think you really need both, and that's why I think the warrior scholar tradition, doers who think and thinkers who do, is so important.
Well, also just to add to that, and my role here at the Center for Brain Health, I mean, obviously what we're trying to do is scale our impact. So all of these different populations, how do you get people to actually learn more about how their brain works, particularly the cognition, but also the other elements of it, what we call emotional balance and connectedness, are also critical for brain health and performance. But the real world experience allows me to know how do you actually propagate that through? Because anytime you design a program in the kind of in too academic an environment, it's not going to necessarily stick when you go to an organization, when you go to the military, when you go to the school system. There's all sorts of barriers to making change happen. So it's very exciting to bring the real world experience to try to make people's cognition improve.
Yeah, it's really critical because I love science as much as anyone. Anybody who knows me will attest to that. But a lot of academics, a lot of journals, they're echo chambers. It's academics talking to other academics, publishing for academics, and it never reaches the outside world and gets any traction. So,
well, but I'm not going to criticize the academic. They've done their role in the ecosystem. I mean, they've done their science.
Yes.
And you can't expect, I mean, an academic that is a deep expert has done incredibly amazing work in what we're talking about with the brain science and neuroscience and neuroplasticity. They're not also going to be the ones that have the skill or the inclination or the time to then move it forward. So other people, in a sense, have to pick up the ball and take that neuroscience and then translate it into these programs that actually improve human performance. And that's what we're trying to do here at the Center for Brain Health.
Exactly. The scholar warrior scholars who bridge the gap. Before we move on, there's one more thing I want to touch on, because you talked about the economic impact of these interventions. And this is a controversial topic because resources are limited and we have to pick and choose which interventions we make on which populations and when. And as an economist, you're uniquely positioned to do that because, like you said, with those early age interventions in school, they're not only is it going to have the most impact when the brain is relatively more malleable, but you get a longer horizon to get a return on your investment because they're younger people. So
absolutely,
yeah. So is there like to comment on how you the who, the when, and the what of these interventions?
Yeah. So let me start out with something that's really important too. That is really at the core of what we do here, which is that when we talk about neuroplasticity and the consequences of it, one critical consequence is you are in charge of your own brain, or the term we use is you are the architect of your own brain. So when we have the neuroplasticity, as I said, there are all these things you can do to either improve or reduce brain performance. So some of them are external, as we talked about, food, nutrition, but biophilia, being in nature, for example. And many of them are internal in the way particularly the way you think and the way you exercise your cognitive resources on that. But you're the architect of it. Now, this has a really critical consequence, both the human and economic consequence. Was if you're the architect of your own brain, the only strategy to improve your brain performance relies on teaching you how your brain works and that you doing it. No one else can improve your brain performance for you, right? Just like no one else can flourish for you, like the song, no one else can feel the rain for you on that. So the way we work is if that is a consequence of the neuroscience, the only strategy that works is teaching people how their brain works, and then teaching them some neuroscience, and then teaching them some consequences of the neuroscience for these sorts of things you want the brain to do for you. So the cognition, connect to people, keeping an emotional balance on it. That's all. That's the way our programs work. So even when we teach the middle schoolers, we teach them some neuroscience because they're not going to understand the principles that we're trying to impart unless they understand why. In fact, there's a school in Dallas that teaches neuroscience at age 3 to age 8 or 9, and they have incredible results because kids want to learn how their brain works on that. Now, how does this tie to the economics? Well, teaching someone some neuroscience and the consequences is not a very expensive intervention. So if I go back to the middle schoolers, for example, I think the number we have is we have a big program in the state of Texas, and it's about $200 per student for intervention. So in a grade like grade 6 or grade 7 or grade 8, and sometimes they get it 3 times when we put the program in, it's $200 per year. Well, if you have something that improves their critical thinking skills, their executive function, their reasoning skills, their ability to synthesize information, and you pay $200 for it, and it has a lifetime impact, you can understand the economics are going to be kind of outstanding. So one of the things that we want to make sure is people understand, if you want to improve people's brain performance, do the simplest and least expensive interventions first. And they are the types of things that we advocate, which is teach people how their brain functions. There's lots of things we can add on that. And we can talk about the fitness, which is really important to me. We can talk about the nutrition. We can talk about the built space, the way it's architected. That all contributes to brain health. But the fundamental things of teaching someone how to be the architect of their own brain is really a low-cost intervention. So then you end up with very good economics because you have a big impact, throughout their lifetime with a low-cost intervention. But that said, even though it's better to intervene early, it's a little bit like that Chinese proverb that says the best time to plant a tree was 50 years ago, but the second best time is today. I mean, I arrived here at age 60 at the Center for Brain Health. I knew about some of these things that we've discussed. I didn't really know any neuroscience or just some popular neuroscience. I've learned so much in the last 2.5 years here, and my brain functions better than it did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Not telling tales out of school because he talks about this publicly. We have the brilliant COO who was trained as a CPA and a lawyer. He joined here at 58, and he'll be very open about saying the way he used the brain back in the day, kind of the way we think about how these professional firms work, completely dysfunctional. He has a much better way of operating his brain now, and he'll tell you that he's now 65. His brain is operating at a higher cognition level than it was 20 years or 30 years ago. So even though it's better to start young, it's never too late to think about the way you think.
And we'll get back to brain hygiene, caring for your brain, an important topic momentarily. But before we do that, I want to touch on that Sudoku trap that you said, this notion that you need to do different stuff you might potentially not enjoy. And my target audience, 40-plus-year-old executives, entrepreneurs, senior professionals, that's the last thing they want to hear, right? I need one more task on my plate.
You don't need one more task.
And you said something in our pregame call that you don't need to do anything different, just do what you're doing now differently. And you talked specifically about zoom in, zoom out, and zoom deep and wide. So would you like to elaborate on that approach to brain training and health?
Right. So what you just referred to is a core part of our cognition training or cognitive training, and it falls under something called integrated reasoning. So, how do you kind of process information in a way optimally and fits with the neuroscience on it? So we have a little framework that we've developed over the years, a critical framework that just teaches people how to do some of this problem solving. And as you said, part of it is 3 parts to it. Zoom in, which is, okay, what are the critical details of that? I mean, I can tell you one thing the neuroscience teaches us: if you're overwhelmed by the details, you're not gonna function properly. You're not gonna have your cognition at peak performance. To give you a simple example, if you have a high school or university student that has a yellow marker and they're yellow marking 85% of the page, that is not going to work, right? Because, what's the purpose of the yellow marker? It's to highlight the critical information that you need for the task you're trying to solve. So zoom in is being able to kind of identify that critical information. Zoom out is to be able to kind of step back and put that information in kind of the wider context of what's going on. And then zoom deep and wide refers to taking other experience and knowledge and vantage points that you have in the world and using that to kind of calibrate what is the right response to this particular problem you're trying to solve. And we just find that is a very effective way of improving your cognition on that. So zoom in, zoom out, zoom deep and wide. And we have online training resources that help people do that, highly interactive, where they can practice it. But once you have the concept of zoom in, zoom out, zoom deep and wide, the idea is not to apply it to an abstract problem. The idea is let's apply it to something that you face every day. I mean, all of us have, the brain is a problem-solving machine, right? It wants to solve complex problems. But if you have a framework to do that in a more efficient and effective way, your brain is going to get better and better at it. So, but just to repeat, Andy, don't add new tasks to your life.
Yeah. Yes, it's if you enjoy Sudoku, do it. But if not, nope, do not feel that you have to. Let's talk about, so we said we would go back to the concept of brain breaks and a broader topic that I call brain hygiene. In our pregame call, you talked about the 5x5. I believe it was the 5x5 concept, the rest recovery activity. So tell me about brain breaks and how the Center for Brain Health views brain hygiene.
No, absolutely. So, I'm sure almost everyone listening in today is doing some physical exercise, and of course, your client group, the people you're working with, many of them are doing exercise at very high. And we all understand if you exercise, if you're in the gym and you're lifting a weight, or even if you're hitting a tennis ball, you do the activity for a period and you take a break. You do 3 times 10 reps. And you take a 30 seconds between each rep, and then when you're switching machines, you take a bigger break. So that concept is kind of well understood. Well, the brain is exactly, Andy, is exactly the same position on there. If you apply effort as you're doing through your meetings and your writings and what you're doing during the day, your brain needs a break. And what we recommend as a starting point is, as you said, 5x5. So this is turning off your brain for 5 minutes. There's different ways to do it. I tend to stay go to my nice chair in my office and kind of lean back a little and close my eyes, just let my thoughts drift. Our chief neuroscientist here actually goes out to her car and she just puts the seat back a little bit and just zones out for at least 5 minutes on that. And I think people will find if they try it that it really refreshes the brain. I mean, we do it daily. That's part of the hygiene for people here at the Center for Brain Health. Yesterday, I was kind of exhausted after one too many meetings. I had my little brain break, was energized for the next few hours on that. So 5 times 5 brain breaks. But the intuition about it should make sense to people because the brain, like any muscle, needs that break periodically. So 5x5.
So I want to elaborate and expand on that topic. In the world I come from, as you mentioned, primarily strength and conditioning coaching, there's the concept of microcycles, macrocycles, mesocycles. So this is how you vary your training and your recovery throughout the year in order to maintain that upward trajectory and potentially peak for certain events, whether it's the World Championships, whether it's the Olympics. And there's really not an analogous concept, or maybe not an as formalized concept in cognitive training, we'll call it. Maybe that's a growth area. But let's expand on those 5x5 breaks and to the concept of extended breaks, vacations. Do you or the Center for Brain Health have a position on the importance of vacations? How to vacation? How frequently?
Yeah, I don't think we have science for that yet, to be honest. As you said, there's science for the different cycles in the physical world. But let me add what I think we do have science for. So part of cognition is, your brain throughout the day, it varies in its ability to perform, and through circadian rhythm, through the way people, the way, really in some cases, genetics that you can't fix. So whether you're a morning person or an evening person, for example, is our neuroscientist, our sleep expert here, Dr. Matthew Walker, would say is hardwired from birth. So one of the things that's really important for this rhythm is, we talked about the brain breaks, but also there's a limit each day to how many complex tasks, really demanding cognitive tasks you can do. And we have an important concept called elephants and rabbits, which is the idea that if you're chasing elephants, don't get distracted by rabbits. And so one of the reasons that people don't perform at their cognitive best, or a common reason, is that they deplete their cognitive resources using their kind of prime cognitive time to chase a rabbit. So if you think about your task list, you've got kind of various tasks. Some are quite simple. You might return an email or pay a bill or return a telephone call. But some are cognitively really demanding. You need to think about the strategy for your corporation, think a complex HR issue on that. So one of the things that we so if you think of the 5x5 breaks as kind of the microcycles, the next tier out of the cycles, at least to the daily cycles, is it really makes a difference if you reserve your prime time, your prime cognition time, for the problems that are hardest to solve. So we have the concepts of elephants and rabbits, as I said. And the idea with an elephant is that's something that you can focus on 45 minutes, because really that's about the amount of time most people can really work at their peak performance cognitively. And this is something that moves your needle. It moves the needle either professionally or personally on that. So those are the times you want to protect those times so that you're working on the most important issues for yourself, the elephants, in the time when your brain is working best. So to give what damages this often, for example, for many people, their prime time is, let's say, 9:30 to 11:30 or 9:30 to 11. So what happens is the corporation ends up, or the organization schedules meetings, which I don't want to say are unproductive. They're important. I hope they're important, but they're not allowing you. They're not the most cognitively demanding activity you're doing, and you basically take that prime time and then you waste it for something that's not so important. And then when it comes to be 1:30 and you're trying to do the prime time task, but your brain is not at its prime time performance, you don't get the peak performance on that. So that's kind of the second wave. That's about as far as we've got. But one of the things that's also critical is people have different prime times. And so if you want to perform your best cognitively, you've got to put the elephant tasks at your peak performance time. So if you're someone whose peak performance time is 4:30 to 6, the elephant should be there. There are other people whose prime time is literally 10 p.m. to midnight. You need to put the highest cognitive load task there. So this, I think, is something very interesting. And there's an emerging concept in organizational theory called chrono work. Is how do you design the work to fit with people's kind of internal clocks and when they work best at different things. And as I said before, the last thing you want to do is waste someone's prime cognitive peak performance time with a low-level task.
That's interesting. You brought that up. There's and sleep science. So if those who have been following me know, we had Dr. Mohammed Usama, sleep physician, on this podcast, and I've been posting on the importance of chronotypes, recognizing your chronotypes when you naturally sleep and wake, and for how long. But until this conversation today, I had not really thought about extending that to when you're most productive, which I'm sure has some correlation with your chronotype for sleep, probably not perfect. Has there been any established work on that, linking your chrono work to your sleep chronotype?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that on that. But I think what we would say, the neuroscientists here, Matt Walker would maybe have a different view as a sleep scientist, but the neuroscience would say, well, definitely when we're with a group of people, everyone knows when their peak performance time is. So they know how, whatever their sleep pattern is, they know how it translates into their cognitive performance time.
Okay. Yeah, potential growth area. We're going to get into apps and biohacking and nootropics momentarily. But before we do that, let's talk about some of the known needle movers. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Walker, bringing him on board, that is a big deal. He's the author of, I believe, the book Why We Sleep, noted world-class sleep scientist. So that's a big deal. Sleep, we know, known needle mover for cognitive performance. Please talk to us about the importance of sleep and those other known needle movers.
Right. So let me reiterate. For us, the biggest needle mover is cognition itself. So if you want to be good cognitively, you've got to make sure you're doing things that allow you to grow and exercise your cognitive muscle. So then beyond that, there are other things that support it. We brought Matt here, as you said, Professor Matt, primarily because in our view, the number two thing is sleep, or maybe even equal. If you don't, I mean, everything, all the science shows, and I'm sure many of your listeners here today know already, if you don't sleep, you're not going to perform cognitively, physically, etc. Beyond that, we know nutrition is incredibly important, though it's hard to link it kind of in a one-to-one way, in the way that sleep is, like, literally, if you don't sleep enough last night, your performance today will go down. Obviously, food is more complex. Movement is very important, but I think movement is really interesting, the science about it. There's a few things I think going on with the science. I mean, one, again, because of this neuroplasticity, there's more and more evidence that the movement or exercise you do needs to be varied, that you get the maximum impact both physically and also in terms of your cognition if you change what you do. So, for example, my own routine, I have some ball sports like ice hockey and tennis but then I also mix it in with strength training, mix it in with aerobic training, mix it in with yoga, Pilates, but also always trying to do new things. Because if you think of what's going on with the neuroplasticity, you're carving new pathways in the brain. So if you always do the same thing, the pathways become static, and essentially the brain, there's a term our neuroscientists use, which is rote is rot. So if you do something by rote, you're in decline. I mean, if your brain is always changing through neuroplasticity, it's very, very difficult to have it in stasis. It's either kind of improving or it's in decline at any point in time. So I even think for the physical exercise, it's not just the quantity of physical exercise, it's also the way that whole routine fits together. And of course, there's more and more evidence that the dancing is kind of, some people would say the best exercise because it combines some physical elements with the complexity, the kind of cognitive load complexity of following the steps, and also with the social interaction. So that leads us to one other game changer, which is just so essential to it, is connectedness. So we use the term connectedness to people and purpose, but connectedness to people is, we just had people, your listeners might have heard of Dr. Ben Ryan. He just wrote a book, very famous neuroscientist, I think at Stanford. He just wrote a book called Why Brains Need Friends, which goes through the neuroscience of the fact you need to be connected to people. I mean, the way the brain was constructed through evolution, I think we would all understand the brain was constructed to be around other people. And one of the things that really kind of disheartens me is the loneliness crisis. And even though I'm just the economist, I actually feel like the loneliness crisis is kind of the gravest threat to industrialized civilizations on that. So connectedness is another kind of, we can call it a biohack, but an important part of brain health and brain performance. Then you have things like biophilia. So this is being in nature. So that impact, we all have this feeling when you're kind of surrounded by nature, or kind of those scenes or the sounds. And of course, the Japanese are actually even thinking about the scents that are in nature and the impact on the brain. We have more and more evidence about the relationship between the arts, but particularly when you're doing the arts. So it's not just a question of listening to music or going to a museum, but also actively participating. Are you painting? Are you making music? That impact. There's some researchers that are doing something very interesting, which is the relationship between brain health and performance and faith. So, does a faith in religious faith in God, have an impact on the way the brain functions? So that's one of the things that makes neuroscience so exciting. So, I've talked a lot about cognition, but you've got all these other dimensions that can actually support good cognition and kind of keep the brain healthy and performing for as long as possible.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up movement. With these longevity all-cause mortality studies, they're by definition long-term. We can't just stick people in the lab for 8 weeks, do a randomized controlled trial and see what works and what doesn't. So they're by definition long-term, correlational, and we can't cleave and dissect exact cause and effect. But you're absolutely right about movement, and of all the great things you said, movement is kind of what's piqued my curiosity. Maybe that's because that's the world I come from. Exercise, but we know blue zones, high longevity peoples. They do exactly what you're talking about. They move around, and it's generally low intensity but frequent activity. So they're gardening, they're woodworking, they're shopping, they're
also
cooking.
Most of the blue zones are in kind of elevated environments where they're also moving, up and down, like climbing up the village and down the village on that, right? I think 4 out of the 5 blue zones are in high kind of places where you just in your daily life you exercise some muscles, because you're climbing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So, altitude, erythropoietin, they've got more red blood cells, better oxygenation. So that is an excellent point. And the one of the connections that excellent book you mentioned, why brains need friends, got me thinking about the movement and the all cause mortality. There's excellent correlation with strength and all cause mortality. And I was until very recently, until that book, Why Brains Need Friends, I was thinking in terms of, okay, well, you're stronger, you're less likely to fall and get hip fractures, which is often what does people in. But the more, maybe a more proximate, prosaic explanation is that those people are strong people able to maintain those social and real
Yes.
and bonds of faith into their old age.
No, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I want to introduce just another concept into the conversation today. So the idea of desirable difficulty. And I think you would understand this very well from the movement world or the sports world. If you're going to maintain or improve your performance, your physical performance or sports performance, you want to be doing things that challenge you at a certain level. And it's like that. I'm sure you've talked with your listeners about Yerkes and dots and things. Kind of, you want that level of stress that's in the prime zone or the flow zone, where it's challenging but not so challenging that people aren't able to do it. And this is well worked out. So that idea of desirable difficulty is something that applies not just to the physical world, but also applies to the cognitive world. So, we really believe that if you design your life so that you have a desirable difficulty, both in terms of cognition challenges and physical challenges, it goes a long way to maintaining your brain health for as long as possible on that. The other thing about the social connectedness that's really interesting is yes, you're connected to people, but also it's cognitively challenging. I mean, navigating social relationships is not actually a simple thing on that. So it's not just the connectivity, like the brains need friends aspect, but it also improves your cognition because it's not easy with a group of human beings.
I want to close the loop real quick before we move on. We're talking about needle movers. So again, it all comes back to fundamentals. The things that really improve are, like you said, exercising your brain with relevant tasks, appropriate difficulty, and then sleep, nutrition, movement are close seconds. After that, is there any merit to biohacks? Any evidence for nootropics?
I mean, we don't study that. We don't have any researchers that are there. I think that the neuroscientists here are generally skeptical that there's kind of the easy biohack. I mean, as the Dr. Sandy Chapman would say, there's no pill that's going to make your brain perform better. So we're reluctant about it. I mean, we're open to seeing what the science tells us over time. But if you go back to what we discussed earlier about being the architect of your own brain, there's no shortcut in our view on that. So,
All right. So let's talk about testing. I'm going to show my biases here. I'm very critical of testing and over testing in our industry. And the reason is that we tend to fetishize it. We tend to use it as a substitute for action. And the reason is that there's no pain. It's cheap or even costless, and it makes us feel good. It makes us feel like we're doing something. So we get a VO2 max and we get a blood test and we get real excited because we're doing something. And so now that I've poisoned the well and revealed my biases, I'd like to ask you, Andrew, what amount of testing, what type, how frequently?
yeah, no, so it's a very good question. So the way we approach this, I mean, from everything we've been discussing today, a legitimate question says, Andrew, you've been talking a lot about brain health and brain performance. So how do you actually measure it? So over the decades, our neuroscientists have developed something called the Brain Health Index, which, a little bit back to our conversation about the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, is different in the sense that it's really trying to measure upward potential. I mean, it measures deficit as well, but the idea is measuring upward potential. And our test has three major dimensions. One is we call clarity, but it's really around cognition that we've been discussing for this hour. One is a part is called emotional balance, which is related to mental health. So mental health is a subset of it. But emotional balance is kind of a broader concept. And the third dimension is connectedness to people and purpose, as we've also talked about during the discussion today. Our test is actually quite complex because you're trying to measure the most complex thing in the universe, and we're trying to measure the upward potential around these dimensions, particularly cognition. So it takes a little over an hour to do. You can't do it in one sitting because it's just not the way the brain works. It has a high cognitive load if we're really going to test cognition, the upward potential for cognition on that. So people do it in several sittings. The way we use this test is people do it every 6 months, and it's meant to just give them an idea whether they're maintaining or improving, or in fact their brain health is declining over time. On that. And we've had people in our research project who've done it up to 13 times. So because we've had this about 6 years in this form, so 13 times, they religiously do it kind of every 6 months. We've had other people do it 10, 8, 7. But as you said, people vary. We have other people who are very committed to improving their brain health and performance, don't necessarily do the test. They don't want to do the metrics, but they have an intuitive sense. And we actually also find with the people that do the brain health index every 6 months, they actually know in advance, based on what's happening in their life, whether the brain health index is going to go up or down, which is really interesting because that goes back to what we talked about before about being the architect of your own brain, is really having enough self-awareness that you know how your brain is functioning. You know at what level it's functioning. And if you contrast that a little bit with the strength training, I mean, you might feel weaker or stronger on different days, but I don't think you necessarily know. Your body isn't necessarily giving you a signal about where you are and lifting a certain kind of weight. Are you close to the maximum? Are you going to hit a new maximum today? But here, the people really have enough understanding of their brain to know how the brain is performing on that, and that to us is a fantastic outcome because that's where we want to get to. And as I said, if you end up having enough insight that you kind of know how your brain is performing without doing the test, then the need for the test kind of goes down. But we would agree with you. We're not trying to create an industry around people testing their brain. And as I said, lots of people do a very good job of managing their brain health and performance without necessarily doing the brain health index. But others find it useful to do, but we're not doing it continuously. We're just doing it once every 6 months and then kind of moving on from there.
And walk us through for a listener who wants to do the brain health index. What's the plumbing, the mechanics of how they go about doing that?
Right. So the way that it's available to the public is through our brain health project. So you're essentially now a citizen scientist kind of doing the research. You begin by doing the brain health index to set a baseline. And this actually, one other thing that's very important about the way we think about it is we don't give people, when they do the brain health index, we don't give them a percentile. We're not trying to rank people. We're not trying to compare you to others. What we're interested in is your brain versus yourself. So is your brain performance improving or declining over time? And if you go back to this kind of longevity thinking, the idea is you want your brain performance staying even or getting better as to the extent possible for as long as possible on that. So the idea is the kind of you versus you. But you can join the Brain Health Project. You start out by doing the Brain Health Index. As I said, it's about a little over an hour and you do it in a few sittings. We give you 2 weeks at the beginning to get it done. And then once you've done the Brain Health Index, you'll get a report from us. And you'll actually, this is the real benefit. You'll get free coaching. You'll have a one-on-one session with a live coach, which we're paying through our research dollars to supply you with, to talk through what we learned from your Brain Health Index. Then you have, for the next 6 months, you have access to all our training assets and other resources. So some of the training is around what we've talked today, what we call our smart training, including that integrated reasoning, zoom in, zoom out, zoom deep and wide, and other concepts around cognition. Some of the training is around sleep. Obviously, we've got Professor Walker here. Some of it is around other things that we find are important. So there's stress is something that's very important to people, understanding about stress. We have a module on confidence. How does confidence work, for example? And you can choose to engage or not engage with those resources over time. And then at the end of 6 months, hopefully you'll do the second Brain Health Index. Now you've got a baseline. Did your brain health over that 6 months go up or down? And I think what we're finding with the evidence is the more people engage with resources, the better their Brain Health Index is. So we have very clear evidence. We've got about I think over 20,000 people have taken the Brain Health Index at least once, but kind of, as I said, to get that effective kind of change over time, we've got well over 10,000, I think, at this point in time. So we have pretty good data that says if you do the Brain Health Index and then you engage with assets that teach you how your brain works, and topics like that, you do the Brain Health Index, again, your brain actually measured this way is actually able to get stronger. Whereas people that do the Brain Health Index don't engage with the assets, don't do much to improve their brain health, often find it decline. So we think that that's really important for us in terms of validation of the way we think about these things.
Well, very impressive. Certainly more thorough than anything else I've seen to date, and I'm pretty close to the market. So that's really saying something. Unfortunately, we're wrapping up now. All good things must come to an end. So, want to get to the lightning round. What would you say is the most overrated brain health trend right now?
The neurotropics, the idea that you can take a pill that improves your brain.
Back to basics. What's the one thing that every executive should start doing this week for their brain that costs nothing?
They should stop multitasking.
Multitasking. And last lightning round question. If you could redesign one institution's approach to brain health, schools, corporations, government, military, what would you change and why?
Schools. So what I would do is I would have age-appropriate neuroscience taught at every age. I mean, one of the problems with doing it later in life is it's hard, anything that a little longer than a lightning round, but anything you want to lock in, you want to hit a tennis ball, it's not one lesson. I mean, I've had hundreds, if not thousands of hours of lessons of tennis in tennis and, hit three or four times a week to maintain, even just to maintain that ability on that. So, the one change that would really make a difference is if you had, curriculum, neuroscience inspired, age appropriate curriculum at every part of the school system, so that this idea that people kind of have an understanding of some neuroscience and the consequences for good brain performance locked in. Because if you do it from age 3 to age 18, you're going to get that lock-in effect. So that's the number one policy I would like to see.
Yeah, that's funny. That goes back all the way to Aristotle and habituation. We on my podcast last week with it was Mike Pannone, so the former special operations soldier, recon, special forces Delta, said the same thing. That's why these one-off things don't work, right? You bring in a speaker and then everybody gets excited for a day, and nothing changes because you haven't you haven't habituated.
But you know this perfectly well from the diet world and the movement world, right? I mean, think about what the impact would be if you had movement built in throughout the school system, so everyone who got to 18, and not just the elite athletes that play on the basketball team or the football team, but everyone encouraged to kind of move in a way that fits with their desires and capabilities. If you've done it from age 3 to age 18, I'm pretty sure those people are going to continue to move throughout their adult life.
Yeah, so listeners have probably heard me gripe about the school system. I won't rehash that here, but it's funny. One of the potentially most useful things that we ever did in school was recess, and that's the one thing we get rid of earliest. All right. Well, Andrew, it's been a great honor to host you as our guest today. For the listener who wants to learn more and keep informed, what should they do? Who should they follow?
Well, I mean, we've got all our brain health resources, the Center for Brain Health in Dallas, Texas, part of University of Texas at Dallas. I think that's a fantastic place to start. I mean, follow our Matt Walker, who of course was at Berkeley and now is with us. Ben Rhyme is a very good one. We have just finished our latest Brain Health Week, so we had lots of really amazing speakers from around the world in different parts of the brain health and brain performance world. So it's all up online, so you can find out the names of people, all of whom are fantastic people to follow. So it's out there, and the one thing that people take away from today is be on your own brain health journey. I mean, only you can guide that journey, and I hope this conversation gives people a reason and a place to start for that journey. But what we find with once people start down a brain health journey, once you start thinking about your own brain and its performance, you're never going to stop.
Amen. Agency. Your brain health is your responsibility. I think that's a great way to end it. Andrew, it was a great honor to host you today. And for the listeners at home, Great resources. I follow them and encourage you to. Thank you, Andrew.
It's been an honor. Thank you. Thank you, Andy.